All right, let me give you a little introduction. We're excited to have with us Steve Norder, who's down in Georgia. And Steve is a teacher, newspaper reporter, and a book editor. And he grew up in Iowa. And the Civil War has always been an interest of his. And that spurred him to undertake some detailed research on the war, and particularly on aspects that are largely forgotten, which is one that he's going to talk about tonight. His work has appeared in Civil War Times Illustrated, Civil War News, and his first book, Lincoln Takes Command, came out in December of 2019. Is that right, Steve?
That's correct. Got out just before the pandemic.
Wow. Well, the subtitle is The Campaign to Seize Norfolk and the Destruction of the Css Virginia. And it's, like I say, it's his first book, and we're anxious to hear about it. He now is in Georgia, and he is a member of the Atlanta Civil War Roundtable. So without further ado, Steve Norder.
Thank you, John. First, I wanted to thank you, John, and Paul, and Jeff for the technical aspects. And I will. I wish I could have been up there in person, but circumstances dictate otherwise. We will hopefully sometime get back up to Fredericksburg. I've been there before. It's a great city, and I love the battlefield. And as John said, I'm speaking from Georgia. Now there is a little bit of counter programming going on. There's a little football game that's supposed to be played this evening. Kicks off about 8 o'clock. And since I am in Georgia, I'm obligated to support the Georgia's football team, and hopefully they'll do well against their big SEC nemesis, Alabama. But in the meantime, I want to talk about Abraham Lincoln, who I'm kind of sure if they had football back in the mid 19th century, I kind of think that Lincoln might have enjoyed watching football. He was very big in sports as a younger man, particularly wrestling. So I am going to kind of interject there and say that I kind of support him. Now I'm going to hit the share screen, and hopefully this will work. No, here, this. Okay, here we go. Okay. Now what I'm talking about is a week with Lincoln. And I'm not really an expert on Abraham Lincoln. There are many people who studied Lincoln's life from beginning to end. The man has been analyzed, criticized, mythologized, and even satirized a lot. Some of you might have even seen the 2012 movie about Lincoln hacking at vampires. You know, but I want to examine Lincoln in the context of 1 week during his presidency. It was an important week. May 5 to 12, 1862, is a week that Lincoln escaped from Washington to sail down to Hampton Roads, Virginia. During that week, he set military goals, and as commander-in-chief, took direct control of the military forces, both Army and Navy, to accomplish those goals. For the first and only time in our history, the president not only carried the title of commander-in-chief, but actually acted as a military commander. Now, George Washington did not do that as president, though he certainly was most capable to lead forces during the Whiskey Rebellion. James Madison also had prior military experience and could have commanded the U.S. military during the August 24, 1814 Battle of Bladensburg, Maryland. But that president, sadly, left the command to his general, and we know what happened after that. The British won. So here's President Lincoln acting as commander-in-chief, but having the most minimal of practical experience in military matters. During the short Black Hawk War of 1832, as a volunteer elected captain, Lincoln never saw action. In fact, he admitted years later that his battle was not with Native Americans, but he had a good many bloody struggles with mosquitoes. To my mind, the spectacular aspect of Lincoln's Hampton Roads campaign was not that he took an active role as a military commander, but that he accomplished his goals without any loss of life. What he did and how he did it are in my book, but it is his personal approach to interactions with those around him that interest me. Abraham Lincoln is the most written about person and the most written about period in American history, but scholars still are learning more about him. There are hundreds of letters, notes, speeches that Lincoln wrote during his life. So you'd think that there's not much more that can be said about him, but we do not know about him day to day. What did he say to those he was with? How did he act? And how did he feel about what was going on? Unlike modern presidents, there was no one writing down every word Lincoln said. There were no video cameras recording him walking from the executive mansion to the War Department, which he often did during the war. No reporters waiting outside for an impromptu news conference on the lawn. And of course, Lincoln did not send out daily tweets. We only get a glimpse of his day-to-day activities and what he said from those who bothered to write them down, sometimes years later. Therefore, this is a glimpse of Lincoln during that 1 week in 1862. It is the impression he left on others during that week. We first meet Lincoln on a rainy Monday, May 5, 1862. It's in the evening, it's dark. A man in a rain slicker is standing outside the entrance gate to the Washington Navy Yard. He is waiting. He is a brigadier general in a city full of officers and soldiers. His name is Egbert L. Veely. Soon a carriage arrives, stops, and out steps the large figure of Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War. The two men meet, then turn to walk into the Navy Yard. They ascend the gangplank of the U.S. Treasury ship Miami and head directly to the main cabin. Upon entering, the two now wet men are greeted by Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, and President Abraham Lincoln. Then to Veely's surprise, he is told that he will make a trip down the Potomac River and on to Fort Monroe at Hampton Roads with three of the most powerful men in the country. The trip's purpose, according to Lincoln's private secretaries, was to ascertain by personal observation whether some further vigilance and vigor might not be infused into the operations of the Army at that point. Now, briefly, this was during Major General George B. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign. This is the Virginia Peninsula right here. I'm hoping that shows my cursor going there. McClellan's plan was to march up the peninsula to Richmond by a side door rather than straight down from Washington. Now, however, McClellan, as his usual habit, became too cautious and had been stuck before Yorktown long enough for the main Confederate Army under Joe Johnston to shift toward a blocking position. And Lincoln had two goals in making his trip. First, he wanted to spur McClellan and his army on toward Richmond. However, the Confederates had abandoned Yorktown the day before the trip, and as it turned out, McClellan did not want to meet with the president anyway. Second, Lincoln had an idea that something could be done in the Hampton Roads to take the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, as well as the Gosport Navy Yard, which was the best Navy yard that the United States had and took over by the Confederates the year before. The result, Lincoln hoped, would be the end of the Southern Iron ship, the CSS Virginia. Ever since the Virginia's appearance 2 months earlier, resulting in the sinking of the USS Cumberland and the burning of the USS Congress, the Navy's North Atlantic blockading squadron at Fort Monroe had been paralyzed. While the northern ship, the USS Monitor's timely appearance thwarted any further destruction by the Virginia, the Navy's focus was on the feared monster. But nothing was being done to remove that monstrous threat. So we have the 3 civilian leaders and the lone brigadier general settling into their cozy stateroom to discuss what could be done to move forward. First, they talked about the overall military situation, which lasted long into the night, according to Dooley. They studied maps, reread commanders' reports, and gave opinions on what was to happen. Many other topics, relevant and irrelevant, were discussed, Dooley wrote later, interspersed with the usual number of anecdotes from the never-failing supply with which the president's mind was stored. I'm going to read Dooley's description of Lincoln, as I think it is one of the best given of him. The general said the evening was an interesting study of the country's leaders, relieved for the moment from their surroundings of their onerous official duties. And Lincoln, of course, was the center of the group. Kind, genial, tender-hearted, magnanimous Abraham Lincoln. It was difficult to know him without knowing him intimately, for he was as guileless and single-hearted as a child, and no man ever knew him intimately who did not recognize and admire his great abilities, both natural and acquired, his large heartedness and sincerity of purpose. His inexhaustible stock of anecdotes gave to superficial minds the impression that he was not a thoughtful and reflecting man, whereas the fact was directly the reverse. These anecdotes formed no more a part of Mr. Lincoln's mind than a smile forms a part of the face. They came unbidden, and like the forced smile, were often employed to conceal a depth of anxiety in his own heart and to dissipate the care that weighed upon the minds of his associates. Now, Lincoln's penchant for telling stories is well known, but those stories had a purpose, though he admitted the stories were secondhand. I remember a good story when I hear it, Lincoln is quoted as saying, but I never invented anything original. I'm only a retail dealer. Now, his friend and protector, Ward Hill Layman, described the president's humor as a plaster that heals many a wound. A Lincoln story could be used to cheer the drooping spirits of a friend, lighten the weight of his own melancholy, a pinch, as it were, of mental snuff, as Layman said, clinch an argument, expose a fallacy, or disarm an antagonist. Mostly, though, Lincoln employed a story as a labor-saving contrivance. Now, eventually, the group on board the Miami came to the conclusion that Norfolk could be taken. The conference ended, and they went to bed. The next morning, with the ship now under sail, continuing down the Potomac River, Lincoln and the others sat out on the quarterdeck. The president entertained us with numerous anecdotes and incidences of his life, of the most interesting character, Dooley said. One of those stories concerned Lincoln's reputation as a young man splitting logs into fence rails. While we were sitting on the deck, Lincoln saw an axe in a socket on the bulwarks, and taking it up, held it at arm's length at the extremity of the helve, with thumb and forefinger, continuing to hold it there for a number of minutes. The most powerful sailors on board tried in vain to imitate him. And Mr. Lincoln said he could do this when he was 18 years of age, and he never saw a day when he could not. Now, this is just a little pointer, but I've picked up a hatchet and tried to hold it at the end of the handle, at the helve, with just thumb and forefinger. And to be honest, I couldn't even hold it there for a couple seconds. He must have had powerful hands. The president not only could tell a funny story, but he enjoyed the humor from others. As he read a recent Harper's Weekly, Lincoln came across a humorous poem by an unknown author. According to Dooley, Lincoln liked the poem so much that he wanted to save it. Instead of requesting me to cut it out, Dooley said, he borrowed my knife and, extending him half at length on the deck, spread the paper before him and cut the piece out. Now, picture President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, down on his knees on the deck of the ship, newspaper spread out in front of him with a knife, and he cut it very carefully out. He looks up at everyone who is looking down on him and says, it was not precisely the attitude of the President of the United States to assume, but it was a good position for a man who merely wanted to cut a piece out of the paper. Now, this poem, which really does not say what it is, amused Lincoln so much that the president had to read it out loud over and over again. He even called the Miami's captain to come down to hear it. It was a very absurd idea, absurdly expressed, but there was something about it that pleased Lincoln's fancy, according to Dooley. The president appeared to enjoy it the more oftener he read it. Now, how many have seen the 2012 movie Lincoln, starring Daniel Day-Lewis playing the president? It's directed by Steven Spielberg. I think that the movie has set the image of Lincoln for a whole generation, much like Walter Houston's portrayal of Lincoln in the 1930 film Abraham Lincoln did for that earlier generation. Now, there is one scene in Spielberg's version that just has struck me as spot on. The scene is set in January 1865 in the War Office telegraph room, where the president could be found frequently as he tried to satisfy his desire for information. With Lincoln, his Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, played very well in the movie by the actor Bruce McGill, who's on the far left here. The leaders, along with a good many others in the room, are waiting to hear if Fort Fisher has been taken. Now, this is appropriate. Today is the 10th, and I believe Fort Fisher fell on the 15th, 5 days from now. That is the key to finally closing Wilmington, North Carolina, the South's then last available port for blockade runners. Everything was tense, Lincoln says. That waiting on the unknown reminded him of a story. Now, at that point, you have to remember, Lincoln and Stanton have been together through many years in this war. Stanton just throws up his arms and says, no, no, no. You're going to tell a story. I don't believe I can hear to listen to another of your stories right now. An exasperated Stanton, Bruce McGill, the actor, storms out of the room, yelling for some report he had to read just then. And of course, in the movie, Lincoln just goes on telling the story to everyone else. Now, I don't know if that portrayal actually happened, but picture this true story that I do know happened in 1862 on board the Miami as it glides down the Potomac. Those on board spot a mile-long row of barges, each laden with stones. Seeing these barges, according to Dooley, Lincoln says, "Oh, that is Stanton's Navy. That is the squadron that Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles would have nothing to do with, in which he and Stanton had a dispute." It was finally decided, Lincoln believed, that the War Department might have a fleet of its own to fight the Merrimack. And there it is. We were all a little scared at that time. Mr. Welles felt bad enough, but he was not scared to listen to Stanton's scheme of blockading the river, said the fleet of boats would be useless and if used, worse than useless. Veely described Stanton's reaction to Lincoln's levity as being disconcerted. The secretary said it was best to prepare for the emergency if the Virginia did attempt to come up the Potomac River to Washington. Now, we all know that that didn't happen. Virginia could not have done that. Your emergency, Lincoln reportedly replied, reminds me of a circumstance which took place in Illinois. The president's story concerned a fellow lawyer, unnamed, on the Illinois judicial circuit. This man, according to Lincoln, was noted for a remarkable development of his breasts, the glands being enormous. The man argued that Providence provided him with that development for a reason, and, according to Lincoln's story, went on to say if he ever had been stranded on an island along with a young infant, he would be able to feed the child. This, he said, remarked the president, with as much apparent sincerity as Stanton showed when he urged a Navy composed of canal boats to stop the Merrimack. In both situations, there would be as much requirement as soon as Stanton's fleet to fight and keep back an iron frigate. The preparation for an emergency, which is about as likely to occur in one case as the other, is very striking. Now, Veely did not record Stanton's reaction to Lincoln's story, unlike in that movie. But given what we know of the secretary's personality, he probably did not laugh at it. The Miami sailed out of the Potomac River into the more turbulent waters of Chesapeake Bay, and then south to Fort Monroe at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. Now, this is a bird's eye view of looking south of Fort Monroe, Hampton Roads with the Union ships. Up in the upper left is the Elizabeth River, and beyond the Elizabeth River is Norfolk, and then across the river is Portsmouth, and behind that is the Gosport Navy Yard. The river is protected by guns, Confederate guns at Sewell's Point, which is labeled number 7, and over here on Craney Island, which is labeled number 8. Then across Hampton Roads to the west is the James River. The party arrived sometime in the evening. Brigadier General John E. Wool was the Army commander in charge of the district around the fort in the northern part of Hampton Roads, the southern part being held by the South. The blockading squadron's Navy commander was Flag Officer Lewis M. Goldsborough. Just to show how serious Lincoln was in accomplishing something, upon Wool boarding the Miami to greet the visitors, the president asked Wool about attacking Norfolk across the roads. The general replied he could not do so without the help of the Navy, naturally, and therefore Lincoln decided right then to go visit Goldsborough on his command ship, the USS Minnesota. Despite the late hour and now darkness, according to Secretary Chase in a letter the next day, it was determined that the president, Mr. Stanton, General Wool, Chase, and General Veely should visit Goldsborough and talk with him about the condition of this and things to be done. So they took the tugboat out to the Minnesota, where a plan was put together for the Navy to attack some of the Confederate defenses guarding the entrance to the Elizabeth River, Sewell's Point, Craney Island, and then have the Army cross the road to invade. Well, even Lincoln could not get Wool to organize his soldiers overnight for an invasion. Therefore, the president had to be patient the next day. Probably to satisfy the president's eagerness for some activity, Stanton suggested the four of them sail out in the roads to one of the many ships that composed the blockading squadron. Sorry, wrong direction. They visited the Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, this is the largest ship and namesake of the richest man in the country. And Vanderbilt had at different times loaned for free or for cost the use of the Vanderbilt, his big ship. They toured the ship and particularly paid attention to the bow area inside the bow, which was heavily fortified for the Vanderbilt's job as a ram. When their tour was over, it was time to officially land at Fort Monroe and have breakfast with General Wool and his staff. Later, Lincoln and the others toured the fort because Lincoln had never been to Fort Monroe or Hampton Roads before, as well as taking a steamer out to the smaller Fort Wool that was named after the general. Previously, it had been Fort Calhoun. During these tours, the president once again showed his mechanical bent. He witnessed the rifling of a gun tube and the firing of the Lincoln gun, which sat outside of Fort Monroe, and the Sawyer gun, which was a different kind of weapon that was at Fort Wool. He then sailed to visit the Monitor. This was the ship that saved the fleet at Hampton Roads from a rampaging Virginia 2 months earlier. This was the ship that, without Lincoln's endorsement the previous September, might not have been built. Upon reaching the iron ship, most of the dignitaries, like other visitors, were filled with enthusiasm and patriotism, ready like a bottle of soda water to effervesce the instant the cork is withdrawn, according to William F. Keeler, the ship's paymaster. But that was not Lincoln. As the boat which brought the party came alongside, every eye sought the Monitor but his own, Lincoln wrote that later that day. He stood with his face averted as if to hide some disagreeable sight. When he turned to us, I could see his lip quiver and his frame tremble with strong emotion, and imagined that the terrible drama in these waters in March was passing in review before him. Keeler said the president was most interested in the Monitor's mechanics. While he only saw a model those many months earlier, stating then, "All I have to say is what the girl said when she stuck her foot into the stocking. It strikes me there's something in it." Lincoln was on the real ship now, a ship that had proven its worth and his favorable decision. He examined everything about the vessel with care, manifesting great interest, Keeler wrote. His remarks evidently showing that he had carefully studied what he thought to be our weak points and that he was well acquainted with all the mechanical details of our construction. Now, these are the officers of, except for the captain of the Monitor, except for this gentleman over here. He's a visitor from the USS Galena. Standing third from left is William F. Keeler. His eyes look a little funny because, he was a paymaster, so he wore glasses. I understand that very well. Keeler concluded that Lincoln's few remarks as he accompanied us around the vessel were sound, simple, and practical. The points of admiration and exclamation he left in his suit. For Lincoln's part, he was just happy to find out that Keeler was a volunteer officer from his home state of Illinois. With that tour over, and following a second consultation with Goldsboro, Lincoln still had more time on his hands. So General Wool suggested he escort his guests out to the soldiers' camps. Now, most of Wool's soldiers were not in Fort Monroe. It couldn't hold that many. But they were on the main part of the peninsula at Camp Hamilton. And Wool was anxious to have Lincoln review his units. As Lincoln and the others waited for mounts to be prepared and a carriage for Stanton, who did not ride a horse, they sat in the fort's telegraph room at Wool's headquarters. Now, a young telegrapher, John Emmett O'Brien, and his older brother, Richard, manned that station. They were civilians. John wrote in a post-war book that he walked into the room whistling Dixie, not noticing the strangers were there. Richard chided me rather sharply for my levity, John said. It was such an unprecedented thing for him to do that I was much confused, and I had only time to feel more surprised than hurt when a tall, lank, ungainly man rose up and told my brother it was all right, that Dixie was his favorite tune. It was Abraham Lincoln. Now, O'Brien continued to watch the group as they moved from the telegraph room to the front porch. They were waiting there to get their horses. The most striking figure of that group that I still see in my imagination is Mr. Lincoln, O'Brien later wrote. There he stands, head and shoulders above the rest, his rugged features illumined by a gleam of humor as the staff searches in vain for gauntlets large enough to fit the firm and honest hand that held the destinies of the nation. So without gloves, the president, upon a fine bay steed, as O'Brien says, Chase, Wool, and his staff, also on horseback, and Stanton in his carriage, left through the fort's east gate to see the soldiers and the countryside, leaving Fort Monroe at Old Point Comfort, crossed the bridge, Camp Hamilton, where Wool instructed his unit commanders to prepare for a dress review upon the group's return. They crossed another bridge into the village of Hampton, which had been partially burned the previous year. And then there's some reports that they continued on all the way over to Newport News and Camp Butler. Now, if he was there, he would have had a chance to see the Css Virginia with a pair of binoculars, of course, because at that time, the Virginia was sitting off of laying off of Craney Island right down here. On the approach back to the military camp, the various regiments were lined up ready for some to march in review and others to stand while Lincoln went by. At one point, the president and his party came upon the 1st Delaware Regiment of Volunteers. Now, this regiment under Colonel John W. Andrews was known for its skill as drilling and marching. The colonel personally had bought brass shoulder scales and white gloves for his enlisted men and required the officers to have epaulets and regulation felt hats with plumes, according to William P. Seville, captain of Company K. It inspired each man with a just pride in it that proved a most excellent esprit de corps, Seville said. Now, the drum major was Patrick Dooley, and he was decked out with the tallest and most gorgeous shako with trimming to match, according to Seville. Now, I have not been able to find a image of Patrick Dooley and wearing his shako. So this substituting is Francis Harvey Saxe Pike from the 1st New Hampshire Regiment. But sitting on the table next to him is his shako, his tall hat, and just looking at it, I believe this has bearskin cover on it and a tricolor plume. And Pike is holding his drum major baton, just to give you an idea how large that is. Now, the regiment's dress parades were so admired that other regiments rescheduled their own parades in order to come watch the 1st Delaware perform. So here was the full 1st Delaware standing in order, waiting for the president to come by. There was Dooley and his band playing and marching along the regiment's front. And here comes Lincoln, accompanied by a very large escort, according to Seville, all mounted. Lincoln turns his horse to follow the band as it marches in front of the regiment, and he's followed by all the others on their horses. But according to Seville, when the band had reached the left of the line and had turned to the right about to march back into position, and Drum Major Dooley with his glittering staff presented at an angle of 45 degrees from his manly breast, had advanced with a martial stride through the midst of his musicians, he suddenly came face to face with the president, and all were brought to a dead halt. The situation was growing serious. There sat the president, looking somewhat embarrassed. There stood Dooley, firm as the Rock of Gibraltar, the equestrian brigade supporting the president, and the band resolutely backing up the drum major, marking time and playing away with their best energy. After a few moments of hesitation, which Seville says provoked a hearty peal of laughter from all, the president finally realized that he was in the enemy's country, where martial law was supreme, and that therefore the civil branch of the government should give way to the military. And doubtless, recognizing the drum major's determinations to do his duty or die in his tracks, turned out of the way with all his followers and opened the road for Dooley and the band out of their dilemma. The next day, Lincoln watched as the Navy finally followed his plan. A 3-ship flotilla, including the ironclad Galena, sailed up the James River early that morning. The orders were to protect General McClellan's left flank along the peninsula, and if possible, go all the way up to Richmond to shell the Confederate capital. While the first tax eventually would be a success, the second would not happen. Galena never made it to Richmond. More immediately, at Hampton Roads, most of the remaining Navy warships set out for Sewell's Point. The fort, along with the one at Craney Island, guarded the entrance to the Elizabeth River. In a 4-hour bombardment, the Union ships pounded Sewell's Point, and Lincoln hoped that the attack would clear the way for soldiers to land nearby. But that hope was dashed when the Css Virginia sailed down from Norfolk. As planned, the Union ships backed off to lure the Virginia out into the road's deeper water. And once there, large ships, including the Vanderbilt, were to ram the ironclad. But the Virginia's commander, Josiah Tatnall, did not let his ship go that far out to give the ramming ships a chance. And Lincoln was disappointed. With the Virginia lurking near Sewell's Point, it was dangerous to send soldiers towed in canal barges over for a landing. The president's campaign was stymied. The following morning, Friday, May 9, the Virginia still was near Sewell's Point, but Lincoln wanted to know how well the point's batteries were manned. Based on information provided the previous day by a deserted steam tugboat captain, the president knew the Confederate military was abandoning Norfolk and Portsmouth. Lincoln was impatient, focused on capturing Norfolk in the nearby Navy Yard and destroying the Virginia. And by nature, the president was not content doing nothing. After breakfast, he took a tugboat out to the USS Monitor. He wanted the iron ship's captain, Lieutenant William Jeffers, to sail over to Sewell's Point to determine if any Confederates were left. The commander-in-chief's order was couched as a request, which to me, it showed he was not yet comfortable giving direct orders to the military. He also knew that Jeffers' superior, Lewis M. Goldsborough, was a stickler for the Navy tradition of command authority. His Excellency, the President, came alongside this morning and inquired whether there would be any military impropriety in my getting underway without your previous order, Jeffers later reported to Goldsborough. I replied to the President, it was necessary and proper that you should be informed in order that you might know that I had not acted without authority. Lincoln took the responsibility upon himself of letting Goldsborough know of the move, and the Monitor headed to Sewell's Point. Now, Paymaster Keeler, remember, on the board of the Monitor, approved of Lincoln's actions. He wrote, "It is extremely fortunate that the president came down as he did. He seems to have infused new life into everything. Even the superannuated old fogies began to show some signs of life and animation. He has been busy today visiting different points, Not a place has escaped him where he thought his presence could do any good. Eventually, the president returned to Fort Monroe to await Jeffers' report on conditions across the roads. To kill some time, Lincoln went up to Colonel LeGrand B. Cannon's office. Now, Cannon was General Wool's adjutant. He had given the president a copy of William Shakespeare's plays the evening before, and Lincoln was very familiar with the Bard's plays, having a particular interest in reading and rereading the tragedies and the histories. As Cannon worked, Lincoln found a comfortable spot near a window to read. After a couple hours, Lincoln called Cannon to join him. "Come in here," Cannon quotes the president, "and sit with me and rest. I will read you some passages from Shakespeare." Now, Cannon said he was surprised how well Lincoln read various passages from Macbeth, King Lear, and King John. But as he said some lines from the King John play, Cannon noticed that his voice became tremulous, and he seemed to be deeply moved. Now, for some of you who read the play a few years ago, or maybe got out of reading it altogether, the play, The Life and Death of King John, concerns the king contending with rebellious nobles and the pesky French, while trying to solidify his crown. In the play, Constance, John's sister-in-law, responds to the king's capture of her son and her belief that John will murder her son to remove any doubt to John's claim as king. Now, Cannon does not say what passage from the play Lincoln read, but a review of the play provides the following likely lines. "Grief fills the room of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. Then I have reason to be fond of grief. I will not keep this form upon my head when there is such disorder in my wit. O Lord, my boy, my Arthur, my fair son, my life, my joy, my food, my all the world, my widow comfort, and my sorrows cure." Cannon said that when Lincoln finished reading, he closed the book. Did you ever dream of some lost friend and feel that you were having a sweet communion with them, and yet have a consciousness that it was not a reality? The president asked Cannon. "Everyone has such dreams," the colonel replied. "That is the way I dream of my lost boy, Willie," Lincoln said, breaking down in most convulsive weeping. Cannon described the scene of Lincoln crying as the most grievous and distressing to see this great, strong man give way to such emotion. And Cannon said he was so sympathetically moved that he too broke down utterly. Lincoln sat there with his head bowed on the table, and Cannon quietly left the room. Now, referring back to that Lincoln movie, you may recall how the president's wife, Mary, played in the movie by Sally Field, admonishes her husband for not being sufficiently distraught over the loss of their son, Willie, to typhoid in February 1862. That movie scene was set in early 1865, about 3 years after Willie's death. But here, Cannon described a very distraught president only 3 months after the loss of his son. Now, one of the things I like about Lincoln is that he had the ability to compartmentalize his emotions. And after that episode concerning Shakespeare, Lincoln was more determined to find a solution to taking Norfolk. He sought out an engineer and a map. Now, it happened that while Lincoln was ordering the Monitor to test the Sewell's Point batteries and then reading Shakespeare, Salmon Chase, the Secretary of Treasury, and General Wool had been scouting for possible landing sites along the Virginia coast. They found such a site. Chase was anxious to tell the president, and Lincoln became very excited about it and decided to go look for himself. So Lincoln, along with Chase and Stanton, took the Miami from Fort Monroe, crossed over to Fort Wool, which is on the Rip Raps, across the channel, picked up a tugboat and some soldiers, and they sailed outside of Hampton Roads down the coast of Virginia. Now, at that time, the Virginia was sitting off of Sewell's Point, but the Virginia could not follow them. Virginia had to stay inside the channel, and the channel went between the guns of Fort Monroe and the guns of Fort Wool, which is why the Virginia never left Hampton Roads. So the president on the Miami, along with Chase and Stanton, and the soldiers and the tugboat following behind, sailed down the coast. And when the water became too shallow for the Miami, the president and Stanton transferred over into the tugboat, continued on towards the shore, and with the tug almost scraping bottom, the president and some soldiers put out in a rowboat. About 6 p.m., with the sun just beginning to set, the American president landed on the beach and walked up and down a considerable distance to assure himself there could be no mistake in the matter, according to Chase. Here is the president of the United States landing and scouting an enemy beach. Chase described the scene as how little the Confederacy dreamed what a visitor it had that night to the sacred soil. The news of Lincoln's daring quickly spread upon the party's return to Fort Monroe. Soldiers greeted him with enthusiastic cheering. The newspaper men at the fort praised Lincoln for taking an important and dangerous reconnaissance, adding not only was the president calm, dispassionate, honest statesman, but a naval and military commander of no mean pretensions. Lincoln's invasion plan was back in business. The rest of that evening and into the night, regiments, along with cavalry and artillery under Wool's command, were marched to the fort's wharves and boarded upon almost everything that floated. This is a watercolor that was done by a soldier just a few days after these events. Showing over here is Fort Monroe on the far left, with soldiers marching in front of that, the board ships on the wharves back here. Further down here is some cavalry unit, more soldiers marching towards these ships. But what I like about this image and why I put it on the cover of my book is this group right down here at the bottom. There's an officer or somebody with a sword pointing off to these cannon here. But next to him is a tall man with a tall hat. I like to believe, without any straight evidence, that is Lincoln. It was a beautiful sight to see them this evening as the long files marched down to the boats to embark, Keeler wrote to his wife. A New York Times reporter described the scene as highly picturesque. We stood upon the beach, the sea perfectly smooth and reflecting, the hundreds of lights that glanced fitfully along from the vessels gliding to and fro, as well as the moon and the stars. The night air was all alive with the songs and cheers of the embarking troops. In the midst of it all was Abraham Lincoln. A Philadelphia reporter said the president was the most busiest and hardest working man on the wharf during the embarkation. By midnight, most of the vessels were loaded and the invasion expedition set sail. Lincoln and the other leaders went back to Wool's headquarters to catch a few hours sleep before they too would head for the Virginia beach. The landing was unopposed early the next morning. While Lincoln watched from a tugboat, Chase went ashore to accompany the little army on its march to Norfolk. Lincoln and Stanton returned to Fort Monroe to wait on the results. It was going to be a long day, and General Wool failed to send updated reports back to the president. As the hours ticked off, Lincoln became more and more anxious. At one point in the morning, artillery fire was clearly heard from the other side of the roads. They could see smoke in the far distance, but there was no explanation. A little while later, Lincoln sent for General Joseph K.F. Mansfield and Colonel Joseph B. Carr. Mansfield had been part of the invasion army, but Wool sent him back to bring over more soldiers. The anxious president asked Carr, "Where is your command?" "At Camp Hamilton, sir," Carr answered. "Why are you not on that side in Norfolk?" asked Lincoln. "I am awaiting orders," came the reply. Lincoln then turned to Mansfield. "Why are you here?" the president demanded. "Why not on the other side?" The general said Wool ordered him to the fort. Now that brought a vehement response by Lincoln, according to Carr. Throwing his tall hat on the ground, the president began uttering strongly his disapproval and disappointment. He then dictated an order to General Wool to require the remaining troops at Camp Hamilton to head for Norfolk, and those already landed to be sped up to take the city. Now, it's not known if Wool received Lincoln's order. I have looked through Wool's receipt book, which is up in Albany, New York, and I could not find an order from Lincoln to Wool. The general already was well along on the road to Norfolk anyway, where he would enter in the late afternoon. At Chase's suggestion, General Veely was made military governor of Norfolk, Portsmouth, and soon Suffolk. With that, Wool and Chase, leaving the various regiments under Veely's command behind, took a carriage back to the landing beach and then sailed to Fort Monroe. Close to midnight, the two walked up from the fort's wharf to the headquarters building. Lincoln had been too keyed up to go to bed. He heard the two men approach. Leaning out the third-floor window while in his nightshirt, the president shouted, "What is it?" "General Wool, to present Norfolk to you," came the reply. Lincoln said to send Wool up to his room and wake up Stanton, who, while also wearing a nightshirt, jumped out of bed to storm into Lincoln's bedroom. Wool already was there, telling Lincoln, "Mr. President, Norfolk is ours," when Stanton burst in. President Lincoln was sitting on the edge of the bed, recalled Colonel Cannon. General Wool was there in full uniform and all covered with dust. Secretary Stanton rushed impetuously into General Wool's arms in his excitement, embraced him fervently. The president broke out laughing at seeing a general in uniform hugging his Secretary of War dressed in a nightshirt. "Look out, Mars," Lincoln's pet name for Stanton. "If you don't, the general will throw you." With her home port now in enemy hands, Josiah Tatnall had only one option to save the CSS Virginia. That was to take her up the James River. However, the effort to lighten the ironclad ship enough to sail up the shallower river proved too much. That left Tatnall with no options. So he ordered the crew to abandon the ship for a long march to Richmond and had the ship set on fire. She blew up close to 5 a.m. the next morning. With the Virginia gone and the cities in Union control, Lincoln wanted to see the results of his campaign. On the steamship Baltimore, the Union's leaders sailed across Hampton Roads and up the Elizabeth River to Norfolk on Sunday, May 11. While at breakfast on the ship, Lincoln again saw the humor in Stanton's late night embrace of General Wool. Lincoln said, "You know, we have been solicited by artists to fill the panels of the Capitol with pictures illustrative of this war. I don't think anything has been done on our side until the capture of Norfolk, worthy of illustration." Lincoln proposed the Capitol should include a painting of Edwin Stanton jumping into the arms of General John Wool. Cannon later wrote that the joke was keenly appreciated, but he didn't specifically note Stanton's reaction. Once at Norfolk, Lincoln did not leave the ship. He could see the city. The U.S. flag was flying over the Custom House, Veely's headquarters. He saw citizens milling about at the city wharves, such as this illustration from Harper's Weekly, across the river at Portsmouth, It was obvious the occupation had taken hold. Just beyond that city was the smoke coming from the smoldering ruins of the Gosport Navy Yard. Lincoln had seen all he needed. He asked the Baltimore's captain to turn around and sail back to Washington. Lincoln had been gone from the capital long enough. Once back, the president was greeted as a military hero. A reporter for the New York Times said Lincoln has given his personal attention and care to every department of operations and has brought a very excellent and safe judgment to bear upon matters which required something more than mere professional knowledge and skill for their solution. Another newspaper reporter wrote, the president is entitled to all the honors of a successful campaign and to the bestowment of the formal title of full general at the result of his visit to Fortress Monroe. A week's operation under his own eyes was enough to destroy the Merrimack, the terror of the nation, and reduce Norfolk and its surrounding fortifications to the just authority of the United States. Now, I like Lincoln because of these glimpses. He comes across as a kind, open person. And Lincoln's endearing quality to me is his sense of humor. Doris Kearns Goodwin put it best in a National Public Radio article from 2012. She quoted Lincoln, who is accused of being two-faced because he was not afraid to change his views on important matters. If I had two faces, the president said, do you think I'd be wearing this face? Goodwin presents Lincoln's ability to laugh at himself as a certain kind of confidence. It means, she said, taking the world seriously, but not taking yourself so seriously at every moment. I'll leave you with that thought about Lincoln. Thank you. Okay. There's Jeff.
Yeah. All you need to do is, there you go.
All right. Anyone with any questions? I guess I'll start with one, Steve. I'm a little confused about the beginning on May 9th. Was this all planned? Did he sit there and go over this with Chase and his generals there? Did they know what they were going to end up doing? Or was this kind of a spontaneous foray into something that they weren't really sure what was going to happen?
No, this was planned. This was Lincoln's campaign. The genesis of it was planned during the trip down from Washington with Stanton, Chase, and General Veely. That then once they got to Fort Monroe and they took that late evening trip to meet with Goldsboro, they settled on this was what was going to happen. The three ships going up the James River, because McClellan had been asking for some Navy help, and set bombarding Sewell's Point, Craney Island, with the idea that soldiers would be towed across and landed. The Virginia coming down thwarted that. So the idea of sending Navy, having soldiers go on ships to invade, that was all planned out. When it was going to happen was only after they found another beach to land on by going outside of Hampton Roads. And this was Lincoln's plan.
Was there any security for those folks besides
just the soldiers that were in the rowboats with Lincoln? And according to Chase, Lincoln walked up and down that beach. It's a nice beach. I've walked up and down that beach too. It's a very nice beach to walk on. Very, very peaceful. Now the previous landing that Chase and General Wool, when they did their original scout, they had seen what they thought were some pickets. But what it turned out to be was a couple women and a dog and some kids. And that was it. So there really wasn't any, I guess, Confederate soldiers guarding the beach.
It's a good thing, I suppose.
Yeah, that would have been a whole different story if Lincoln was there and he was captured. I think you would have had a whole different result of the war.
Anyone else with any questions? This group isn't usually that silent.
I either put them to sleep or they're wowed.
How about telling us a little bit, Steve, about what exactly set you on this path to this particular aspect of this particular week? Where did it, I mean, what did you read or what did you see that you said, oh, wow, we got to look at this further?
Well, like all of you, I read a lot of different Civil War books. I have this is just a small part of my collection. And when I first started studying Civil War, I was mainly Army. But then I've more recently, in the last 15 years, I got more interested in the Navy aspect. And so I was reading more about the Monitor and the Virginia and other ironclads and all that, and also the Mississippi River campaigns. And I kept coming across this in those books. Towards the tail end of it, there would be a statement. President Abraham Lincoln came down to Hampton Roads. Norfolk was captured. Doesn't say who captured them or why, and the Virginia was blown up. Okay, I'd read some things about Lincoln, his life, and it would have maybe a paragraph or two saying President Lincoln went down to Hampton Roads, and sometimes it'd say that he participated or did something, but sometimes it'd say he was just an observer. And it just got me interested in finding out more about it and finding some primary documents. And once you start reading primary statements, particularly, I think Salmon P. Chase letters to his daughter was the initial thing where it really sounded like Lincoln did more than just watch. And then I came across Veely, and it just snowballed from there. But it took me about 10 years worth of research because, of course, we all have jobs but I took advantage of whatever time I could and going to archives, including made a trip to London for other reasons and said, okay, I'm in London. I needed to go to the British archives because there are statements there. British had observership at Hampton Roads, and that captain made some observations and wrote them down. So.
Well, it must be a really satisfaction to see your book in print and to see it. And I'm glad that Css Beatty went ahead and published it because they're a good friend of some new authors I know. And
yes, yeah, that Ted Savas was very great, and when he saw, I guess I sent him about maybe the first 3 chapters, draft chapters, and he said yes, he wanted it, and that was very encouraging. As a first-time author, when you have a publisher tell you that yes, they want what you're doing and they like it, that doesn't always happen.
Right. So tell everybody where you can get it. It's on Amazon, I suppose, right?
It's on Amazon, and you can also get it from Css Beatty directly. If you get it from Savas, from Ted, they have book plates that I've signed. And if I can get up to Fredericksburg, I'd be happy to meet people and sign the book directly myself.
Yeah, that's always a big highlight of our meetings when that happens, to get chat with author personally and get a signed book. So
Yes,
yay.
as I say, that the book came out just before the pandemic, and so out of I've only done one in person, and that was closer to Atlanta, and
Mhm.
everything else has been on Zoom. So I have not had the pleasure of going out and actually talking and meeting with people like yourselves at the round tables. I'm really missing that. I wish that I could have done that. But maybe sometime I'll be able to. You'll ask me back, and I can give a different talk, and we can it can be in person.
Well, I hope so. And if you're not, you don't even have to give a talk. If you're up in Fredericksburg, at the time we're having a meeting of an open invitation to come visit us.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Is there anybody else have a question? You're a silent group tonight. Come on. Anybody? I guess not. You know what it is? It's this Zoom thing. People are
Oh, can you all hear me?
Go ahead, Mark.
Yes.
Yeah, see, I thought Jeff had to control, but so I'm sitting here waving, but I had never really paid a lot of attention to this particular expedition before. I appreciate the presentation, and my statements here are more comments than they are questions, and maybe getting some of your inputs on this. But I was thinking as you were talking about this, what a strange expeditionary force this is, because you have the Secretary of Treasury, of the Secretary of War, a very low-level general officer, Brigadier Avili, and then the president, and virtually no other senior military people involved whatsoever. And I was thinking, at this point, Lincoln must have been pretty frustrated, obviously, with the professional military, and probably very much so with George McClellan. And this doesn't really have an answer. I mean, there's no documentation. I'm just interested in the author's views, but it almost strikes me as Lincoln sitting back in Washington going, I am tired of hearing people tell me how hard this stuff is to do. And so he goes down and he does something. He does something down at Norfolk, succeeds at it, and goes home and thinks to himself, I'm sick of these professional soldiers telling me I can't do this. It's just too complicated. I can't handle it. And the immediate impact of that to me, and I led the tour down to 7 days earlier this past year. And one of the problems McClellan claimed that he had is he didn't have access to McDowell's Corps, which is held up in Fredericksburg, because decisions in Washington are going to withhold those troops because of fears of Stonewall Jackson. What I'm getting to here is that maybe this puts Lincoln in a position where he is more confident to actively dispute McClellan on issues. And obviously there become more and more direct confrontations between the administration and McClellan. And maybe before Lincoln had, quote, gone out and done it himself, he was not really comfortable with making those kinds of challenges. Could I get your view on that?
I think that's a good observation. The president, as I said, did not have a lot of military experience, and he did borrow books from the Library of Congress on military matters, and he read. He was frustrated with McClellan, especially the way McClellan sat right in front of Yorktown for so long. And having done this campaign, he went back to Washington, and he thought he knew a little more and he could control things a little better. Now, this is in my book as part of the aftermath, but McClellan did want McDowell's troops, but Lincoln also wanted some of McDowell's troops because of Jackson. Lincoln went to the War Department, mapped and studied the maps, and saw where Jackson was in the valley. He saw where he had three small armies, and he wanted McDowell to send Shields to the valley to augment the forces to catch Jackson. Lincoln told his generals by looking on the map, I want you here to go to Port Royal, sorry, and another general to go there to this town, and Shields to go here, because he was trying to block off Jackson from going back up the valley, which, going south. And Lincoln was frustrated because he was telling these generals to do this by telegraph, and they didn't follow his orders. They said, well, the road that you wanted me to go on was not really a road. It was just a path. There was no food there. My soldiers had to eat. So we went this way instead. And because they didn't follow what he wanted to do, and they probably had some good reason for it, Jackson got away. He fought three, his little battles separate instead of those three units coming together to confront him. That kind of taught Lincoln also that he may know what he wants. His goals are good, but he does not have the experience or the training to understand logistics, to understand how to move troops through areas. And that, the Hampton Roads campaign would not have given him any of that anyway. So overall, I agree with you that he was frustrated, and he remained frustrated, for a long time until he got Grant. But he also knew that he could not handle things directly as a military commander. He was not able to do that. And I believe that's one of the reasons why he brought Halleck from the West, to give him that military support, where he could go through Halleck, and Halleck would put things in the right wording and consider all the other aspects of a military movement that Lincoln did not understand.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more comments, questions? All right, hearing none. Steve, thank you so much for that insight.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thanks to everyone there.
And good luck to you down there in Atlanta. And are you working on any new projects, or is this something that took up so much of your time, you're going to rest on your laurels for a while?
Well, as all authors, I have a list of various story ideas, some magazines, some books, but until I can get into archives and do some primary research, I cannot say if there's enough material for any of them.
Right.
There's only so much you can do on the internet.
Yep.
And for two years now, I've not been able to get into archives. One of my goals coming up to Fredericksburg to give the presentation there was the next day, tomorrow, to go to Norfolk and do some research. Not going to happen.
Well, hopefully that'll happen one day in the not too distant future. So
yeah,
thanks again.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.